Stalin did not rule the Soviet Union through constant terror, and this is one of the most important truths that was deliberately hidden for decades. Terror under Stalin was not continuous, not because the regime was humane, but because it was unnecessary to maintain violence at all times. Stalin understood that fear becomes far more effective when it is unpredictable. People were not meant to live in permanent panic. They were meant to live in permanent uncertainty. Any ordinary day could suddenly become dangerous, and that possibility reshaped behavior more deeply than daily repression ever could. Under Stalin, rules changed without warning, loyalties expired without explanation, and yesterday's correct opinion could become tomorrow's crime. When consequences are unclear, resistance collapses faster than under visible violence. People stop asking what is right and begin calculating what is safe. This shift happened slowly but completely. Society learned to measure every word, to study facial expressions, to interpret silence as survival. Stalin did not need to arrest everyone, because he succeeded in teaching people to imagine arrest everywhere. Fear followed citizens into kitchens, workplaces, and private moments of thought. Families learned to pause before answering simple questions. Children learned which topics caused adults to lower their voices or change the subject. Silence became an instinct rather than a decision. What was hidden for so long is that Stalin's power did not rely primarily on prisons, executions, or secret police raids. It relied on transforming fear into an internal habit. Once fear becomes internal, authority no longer needs to shout or explain itself. It only needs to exist. People begin to police themselves, censor one another, and adapt without instruction. This invisible pressure created a society that appeared calm on the surface while remaining deeply anxious underneath. Stalin's greatest success was not the scale of repression, but the way repression became unnecessary most of the time. When fear lives inside people, power does not need to knock on the door. It only needs to wait. What Stalin hid just as carefully was how deeply fear transformed everyday life, long before it reached prisons or execution lists. Terror was not only something that happened to others. It was something people carried with them at all times. Arrests usually took place at night, not by accident, but by design. Daytime was meant to look ordinary. Factories worked, schools opened, newspapers printed slogans about progress and unity. Night, however, belonged to uncertainty. People learned to sleep lightly, listening for sounds in stairwells, for engines stopping outside, for footsteps that did not belong. This rhythm divided life into two realities: the visible one, where nothing was wrong, and the hidden one, where everything could collapse without warning. Families adjusted their behavior accordingly. Conversations became cautious. Jokes disappeared. Opinions were tested indirectly, through hints and pauses. Children absorbed these rules instinctively. They learned which questions made adults uncomfortable, which names were never spoken, which memories were dangerous to recall. Fear was no longer enforced only by the state, it was reinforced socially. Neighbors watched neighbors. Colleagues avoided sincerity. Silence became a form of loyalty. What most people never understood is that this environment did not require constant intervention from secret police. The system worked precisely because it taught people to regulate themselves. Once fear becomes social, it multiplies without effort. A careless word could travel through whispers, distort itself, and return as an accusation. Because of this, people preferred absence to honesty. They avoided conversations rather than risk misunderstanding. Over time, fear reshaped language itself. Sentences became vague. Meaning hid behind tone rather than words. People spoke not to communicate truth, but to signal safety. This psychological compression was one of Stalin's most effective tools. It reduced complexity, discouraged trust, and made independent thought exhausting. The greatest silence of the era was not imposed by force. It was chosen, repeatedly, because it felt safer than clarity. Stalin did not need to demand obedience in every moment. He built a world in which obedience felt like common sense. Another truth that remained carefully hidden for decades is how Stalin actually came to power. Popular history often presents his rise as either inevitable or dramatic, as if the system naturally produced him or he seized control through sheer force. In reality, Stalin's ascent was quiet, methodical, and almost invisible to those who did not understand how power truly functions. While other leaders argued publicly about ideology, revolution, and the future of socialism, Stalin focused on something far less inspiring but far more effective: administration. He controlled appointments, party records, internal correspondence, and access to decision-making. These were not positions that attracted attention or admiration, but they determined who advanced, who was transferred, and who slowly disappeared from influence. Stalin memorized names, personal histories, alliances, and weaknesses. He understood that power does not announce itself, it accumulates. Step by step, he placed loyal figures into seemingly unimportant roles that quietly shaped outcomes behind the scenes. By the time rivals recognized what was happening, their support networks had already been dismantled. Allies were reassigned, isolated, or framed as unreliable. Conflicts were documented selectively, conversations rewritten in minutes, and disagreements preserved in files that could later become evidence. What made this process so effective was its banality. Nothing appeared illegal or revolutionary. It looked like normal organizational work. This is why it was so difficult to resist. There was no single moment to protest, no clear line where opposition could begin. Stalin did not defeat his rivals in open ideological battle. He outlasted them administratively. History later described his rule as unavoidable, but this narrative hides an uncomfortable truth: authoritarian power can grow without spectacle, violence, or mass support. It can emerge from routine compliance, from people doing their jobs without questioning the system those jobs serve. Stalin's rise was not built on passion. It was built on patience, paperwork, and the willingness of others to underestimate him until it was too late. One of the most uncomfortable realities that Stalin carefully concealed was how authoritarian systems are built not on fanaticism, but on gradual adaptation. Stalin did not demand that millions abandon their beliefs overnight, nor did he require constant ideological enthusiasm. Instead, he asked for something far simpler and far more reliable: adjustment. People were encouraged to wait, to remain quiet, to postpone disagreement, to avoid attention, and to accept temporary compromises that quietly became permanent. Each individual concession appeared minor and reasonable when viewed in isolation. Together, they formed a structure that became nearly impossible to challenge. Individuals learned quickly that open resistance was unnecessary for the system to function. Passive cooperation was enough. Careers depended on silence. Safety depended on invisibility. Families depended on not standing out. These incentives reshaped behavior more effectively than slogans ever could. Stalin understood exhaustion better than belief. He knew that people overwhelmed by uncertainty eventually stop asking fundamental questions and begin focusing only on immediate survival. Under these conditions, morality shifts quietly. Right and wrong are replaced by safe and unsafe. Truth becomes secondary to timing. Speaking honestly is no longer evaluated by accuracy, but by potential consequences. Over time, this logic spreads into every aspect of life. People stop correcting obvious lies, not because they believe them, but because correction feels dangerous. They stop reacting to injustice that does not affect them directly, telling themselves that involvement would only create unnecessary risk. They learn to interpret silence as intelligence and caution as wisdom. Stalin's system rewarded those who adapted fastest, not those who believed most strongly. This explains how the regime could function even among millions who privately disagreed with it. Disagreement did not matter if it never translated into action. What history often hides is that authoritarianism does not require mass loyalty. It requires mass adjustment. Once people reorganize their lives around avoidance, power no longer needs to justify itself. It becomes the background condition of existence rather than an active force. Control deepens without visible violence. Stalin did not conquer society in a single moment. He trained it gradually. Each year of adaptation made the next year easier to endure, until what once felt unacceptable became routine. The danger of this process lies in its subtlety. It rarely feels dramatic. It feels practical. It feels necessary. And by the time people recognize what has happened, they no longer remember when resistance felt possible, or when silence still felt like a choice rather than a reflex. This gradual normalization of restraint created a society where personal responsibility dissolved into collective avoidance. Individuals rarely saw themselves as participants in repression. They saw themselves as observers, survivors, or victims of circumstances beyond their control. This self-image was encouraged. If no one feels responsible, no one feels guilty. Stalin's system thrived on this psychological displacement. People convinced themselves that their silence did not matter, that one voice could not change anything, that survival required patience rather than courage. Over time, these justifications hardened into beliefs. Entire generations grew up learning not how to challenge authority, but how to coexist with it. Children were taught obedience not through fear alone, but through example. They watched adults hesitate, deflect, and avoid. These behaviors became normal, even respectable. To be cautious was to be mature. To speak openly was to be reckless. Stalin's greatest achievement was turning repression into common sense. Once this transformation was complete, the system no longer needed constant enforcement. It reproduced itself through habit. People corrected one another, warned one another, and enforced boundaries without orders. Authority became invisible, embedded in everyday decisions. This is why the system proved so resilient. It did not depend on one man's presence. It depended on learned behavior. Even when fear lessened, the habits remained. People continued to censor themselves long after the immediate threat passed. This endurance is what made Stalinism more than a political regime. It became a social condition. And this is why its legacy outlived Stalin himself. The most effective systems of control are not those that shout the loudest, but those that teach people to remain silent voluntarily. Understanding this process is essential, because it reveals how power can survive without constant coercion and why societies often fail to recognize danger until it feels normal. This lesson is uncomfortable, but it is the most important one Stalin left behind. It shows that repression can become invisible when people learn to live around it instead of against it. And once that happens, power no longer needs fear to enforce silence, because silence enforces itself. This is the quiet legacy that statistics alone can never fully explain. It remains relevant wherever obedience feels safer than responsibility. Today. Always. Now. Another layer of truth that Stalin deliberately concealed was how the system of purges functioned not primarily as a response to threats, but as a mechanism to prevent stability itself. Official explanations spoke of enemies, traitors, conspiracies, and necessary defense of the state. In reality, the purges served a deeper purpose. They ensured that no one, at any level, could ever feel secure long enough to build independent authority. Under Stalin, success itself became suspicious. Competence attracted attention. Initiative created risk. The safest position was invisibility. This logic distorted every institution. People learned not to excel, but to blend in. Decisions were delayed, responsibility was avoided, and initiative was quietly punished. Stalin did not need to identify real opponents. He needed uncertainty to remain permanent. When no one knows where the line is, everyone assumes they might already have crossed it. The purges reinforced this condition repeatedly. They reminded society that loyalty had no expiration date and no final proof. A person could serve faithfully for years and still be destroyed overnight. This unpredictability was not a side effect. It was the message. Fear was refreshed periodically to prevent normalization of safety. Even those carrying out repression were never protected from it. Officials in the security services understood that proximity to power increased danger rather than reduced it. Many participated not because they believed in the system, but because refusal was unthinkable. Over time, this dynamic produced a ruling class incapable of trust. Alliances were fragile. Friendships were liabilities. Information was fragmented deliberately, ensuring that no individual ever saw the full picture. Stalin benefited from this fragmentation. A divided elite cannot coordinate resistance. It can only compete for survival. What history often hides is how deeply this environment damaged governance itself. Decisions were shaped not by accuracy, but by fear of consequences. Reports were softened, warnings delayed, and bad news filtered to protect the messenger. This distortion had catastrophic effects, especially in moments of crisis. Yet the public image of control and decisiveness was carefully maintained. Parades continued. Newspapers celebrated progress. The illusion of order concealed an internal system that was brittle and anxious. Stalin preferred this fragility. A strong institution could challenge him. A fearful one could not. Over time, the purges trained society to associate safety with conformity and danger with competence. People learned that survival depended not on doing things well, but on doing them quietly. This inversion of values reshaped professional life across the country. Doctors hesitated to diagnose honestly. Engineers avoided innovation. Military officers feared initiative. Every profession adapted to the same rule: do nothing that draws attention. Stalin's system punished mistakes, but it punished originality even more. This environment created long-term damage that outlived the terror itself. Even when arrests slowed, the habits remained. People continued to limit themselves long after the immediate threat passed. This is why the purges cannot be understood only as episodes of violence. They were lessons. Each wave taught society how to behave when fear governs opportunity. Stalin hid this lesson behind statistics and accusations. But its real function was behavioral training. Once learned, it did not need to be repeated constantly. The memory of unpredictability was enough. And in that memory, power found permanence. Another truth that Stalin concealed with particular care was how reality itself was managed under his rule. Control was not limited to people or institutions. It extended to memory, language, and the past. Stalin understood that power over the present is temporary if the past remains uncontested. For this reason, history under his rule was not recorded, it was continuously rewritten. Events did not simply happen and remain fixed. They were edited, reframed, and replaced depending on political necessity. Individuals who once appeared in photographs, documents, or textbooks could vanish without explanation. Yesterday's hero became today's traitor, and tomorrow's non-person. This instability was not confusing by accident. It was designed to exhaust resistance. When the past itself cannot be trusted, argument becomes pointless. People stop debating facts and begin waiting for instructions. Children learned that history was not something to remember, but something to update. Teachers adjusted lessons year by year, sometimes month by month, without explanation. Students learned that curiosity was dangerous and certainty temporary. Language adapted accordingly. Words became cautious. Phrases were chosen not for accuracy, but for safety. Certain topics disappeared entirely, replaced by approved formulas that could be repeated without risk. Stalin did not need everyone to believe official narratives. He needed them to stop believing in the possibility of objective truth. Once truth becomes unstable, power no longer needs to defend itself. Any alternative explanation can be dismissed as outdated, incorrect, or hostile. This fragmentation of reality had profound psychological consequences. People learned to maintain multiple versions of the same story, depending on context. One version for public speech, another for private conversation, and a third that remained unspoken even among trusted friends. Over time, this mental division became automatic. People no longer noticed the contradiction. It felt normal. This normalization was one of Stalin's greatest achievements. A society that cannot agree on what happened cannot unite around what should happen next. Memory becomes individual, fragmented, and fragile. Collective action becomes impossible. Even suffering becomes isolated, because people cannot connect their experiences into a shared narrative. Stalin's control over archives reinforced this condition. Documents were sealed, altered, or destroyed. Access was restricted to those who already aligned with the official line. Verification became impossible. Rumors replaced evidence. Doubt replaced certainty. And doubt, unlike outrage, paralyzes. What history often reduces to censorship was in fact something more sophisticated: the management of meaning. Stalin did not simply ban information. He flooded the system with revisions, corrections, and contradictions until truth itself felt unreliable. This strategy ensured long-term obedience without constant enforcement. People learned that remembering accurately was risky, but forgetting was safe. Over time, forgetting became easier than remembering. This preference shaped an entire culture. Even after Stalin's death, the habits remained. People hesitated to recall details, avoided precise language, and treated memory as something flexible rather than fixed. This legacy outlived the regime because it had been internalized. Stalin did not just silence people. He trained them to doubt their own recollections. And once people no longer trust their memory, power no longer needs to erase the past. The past erases itself. Another aspect of Stalin's rule that remained largely hidden was how deeply paranoia shaped decision-making at the very top of the system. Despite absolute authority, Stalin never felt secure. Power did not bring him confidence. It intensified his fear. He trusted no one completely, not advisors, not generals, not doctors, not even members of his own family. This distrust was not merely personal. It became policy. Stalin interpreted uncertainty as threat and difference as potential betrayal. As a result, decisions were often made not on the basis of evidence, but on suspicion. Entire groups were punished not for what they had done, but for what they might do. Preventive repression became normal. Ethnic minorities were deported en masse under the assumption of possible disloyalty. Professionals were accused of sabotage for making mistakes. Medical diagnoses were questioned as plots. Expertise itself became dangerous, because knowledge implied independence. Stalin's paranoia transformed the state into a system that treated unpredictability as hostility. This mindset reshaped institutions profoundly. Officials learned that honesty could be fatal. Reporting problems accurately meant attracting attention. As a result, information moved upward in distorted form. Bad news was softened, delayed, or hidden entirely. Warnings were framed cautiously. Failures were blamed on subordinates or external enemies. This created a leadership that was increasingly isolated from reality. Stalin believed he was controlling everything, but in truth he was governing through echoes of his own fears. The system learned to mirror his suspicions back to him. This feedback loop intensified repression. Each perceived threat justified new measures, which in turn created more instability, reinforcing the sense of danger. What history often hides is how much this paranoia weakened the state. Decisions made under fear are rarely rational. Strategic errors multiplied. Resources were misallocated. Capable individuals were removed at critical moments. During crises, especially war, these distortions became lethal. Yet the image of infallible leadership was preserved carefully. Mistakes were never attributed upward. Responsibility flowed downward, disappearing into silence. Stalin's paranoia also reshaped personal relationships. Loyalty was constantly tested but never confirmed. People lived under the assumption that trust was temporary. This prevented solidarity and ensured isolation. A fragmented elite could not challenge authority even if it recognized disaster. Over time, paranoia became normalized. Suspicion replaced cooperation as a default mode of interaction. People learned to interpret ambiguity as danger. This psychological environment did not disappear when repression eased. It lingered in habits of thought, in professional caution, in social distance. Even after Stalin's death, institutions struggled to rebuild trust because distrust had been trained systematically. The hidden truth is that paranoia was not a side effect of Stalin's rule. It was one of its engines. By projecting his fear onto society, Stalin ensured constant vigilance without constant command. People learned to anticipate accusation, to preemptively defend themselves, and to assume hostility where none existed. This internalization of suspicion made control durable. A society that fears itself does not need an external enemy. It polices its own boundaries. Stalin understood this instinctively. His greatest fear became his most effective weapon. One of the least discussed but most revealing aspects of Stalin's rule was how war exposed the hidden weaknesses of the system he had built. Public memory often reduces the Second World War to a story of heroic endurance and eventual victory, but this narrative conceals how close the state came to collapse because of Stalin's earlier policies. Years of purges, fear-driven appointments, and paranoia had hollowed out institutions long before the first shots were fired. Military leadership had been decimated not because it was disloyal, but because it was competent enough to be perceived as dangerous. Initiative had been punished, independent judgment discouraged, and honest reporting replaced with optimism designed to please superiors. When war arrived, this system could not suddenly transform itself into an effective command structure. Information was delayed or distorted. Warnings were ignored because they contradicted expectations. Officers hesitated to act without explicit orders, fearing punishment more than defeat. Stalin himself initially refused to accept intelligence reports that did not align with his assumptions. This was not stubbornness alone, it was the product of a system trained to equate surprise with betrayal. As a result, early losses were catastrophic. Entire units were encircled and destroyed. Millions were captured. These failures were not accidents of war. They were consequences of a political environment that had trained fear into every level of decision-making. Yet, even in disaster, the system responded predictably. Responsibility was pushed downward. Commanders were accused of treason rather than incompetence rooted in structural decay. Repression intensified instead of reflection. This reaction further discouraged honesty at the very moment it was most needed. What Stalin hid was not simply military failure, but the cause of it. A system that punishes truth cannot adapt quickly to reality. Over time, necessity forced limited changes. Some commanders were allowed more discretion. Brutal discipline was balanced with pragmatic tolerance. But these adjustments were reluctant and incomplete. Victory came at an immense cost precisely because learning was so slow. After the war, the narrative was carefully reconstructed. Early failures were minimized or erased. Heroism was emphasized, while structural responsibility vanished from official history. The population was taught to remember sacrifice, not mismanagement. This selective memory served an important purpose. It preserved the image of infallible leadership and prevented uncomfortable questions about how many lives had been lost unnecessarily. Stalin understood that victory offered an opportunity not only to claim legitimacy, but to overwrite the past. War became proof of correctness rather than a test that had nearly exposed fatal flaws. This rewriting extended beyond military history. It reinforced the broader lesson that results justify methods. If the state survived, then the system must have been right. This logic silenced criticism and reframed suffering as necessity. What remained hidden was the fragility revealed by crisis. Stalin's system did not triumph because it was efficient. It survived despite its inefficiencies, at extraordinary human cost. The danger of this concealment lies in the lesson it teaches. When survival alone becomes proof of correctness, accountability disappears. Mistakes are absorbed into myth. Structures are preserved rather than examined. This is why post-war Stalinism hardened instead of softening. Rather than reconsidering the mechanisms that had nearly destroyed the state, the regime doubled down on control, secrecy, and silence. The war did not expose the system publicly. It taught it how to hide its failures more effectively. And that lesson shaped everything that followed. Another dimension of Stalin's rule that remained largely concealed was what happened after terror paused, when violence no longer needed to be constant to remain effective. This period is often misunderstood as a time of recovery or normalization, but in reality it revealed how deeply repression had been absorbed into everyday behavior. By this stage, the system no longer depended on frequent arrests or visible punishment. It depended on habits that had been learned over years of uncertainty. People continued to censor themselves even when immediate danger diminished. They avoided precise language, distrusted spontaneity, and treated initiative with suspicion. Silence had become cultural. This persistence is one of the most important yet least discussed legacies of Stalinism. Fear does not disappear when the source weakens, it lingers as behavior. Institutions reflected this transformation. Meetings became rituals rather than discussions. Decisions were framed to avoid responsibility. Innovation was treated as risk. The goal was not improvement, but safety. This atmosphere slowed progress and rewarded conformity long after terror subsided. What Stalin hid was that the system he created no longer required him. It could function autonomously because people had internalized its rules. This autonomy made reform extremely difficult. Any attempt to change behavior was interpreted as danger. Even well-intentioned initiatives triggered anxiety because they disrupted familiar patterns of avoidance. Over time, this produced a society that equated stability with immobility. Change itself became threatening. Memory played a crucial role in maintaining this condition. People selectively forgot details that complicated the narrative of endurance. Suffering was acknowledged abstractly but disconnected from cause. Responsibility dissolved into inevitability. This psychological distancing allowed society to move forward without confronting how deeply it had been reshaped. The state encouraged this amnesia by promoting narratives of resilience rather than examination. Survival was celebrated, while mechanisms were ignored. Stalin understood that memory is not preserved automatically. It must be curated. By allowing limited acknowledgement of pain without analysis, the regime ensured that lessons remained shallow. This approach also protected those who had participated. Silence was mutually beneficial. It shielded victims from reliving trauma and shielded perpetrators from accountability. Over time, this shared silence became a social contract. Speaking too precisely felt like betrayal, not only of the state, but of communal stability. This is why even after political shifts, conversations remained cautious. The language of fear outlived the fear itself. What history often overlooks is that authoritarian systems do not end when leaders die. They persist through learned behavior, institutional inertia, and unresolved memory. Stalin's greatest concealment was not a single crime or policy, but the depth of this transformation. He left behind a society trained to navigate power indirectly, to read between lines, to treat clarity as danger. This training did not vanish with policy changes. It shaped generations. Children raised by cautious parents inherited caution. Professionals trained under constraint taught restraint. Over time, these patterns appeared natural, even sensible. This normalization is what made the system so resilient. It did not rely on belief or enthusiasm. It relied on routine. And routine, once established, is remarkably difficult to dismantle. Attempts to reform such systems often fail not because people oppose change, but because they no longer know how to act without restriction. Freedom requires skills that repression erodes: trust, initiative, and confidence in one's own judgment. Stalin's system systematically weakened these capacities. What remained was a population capable of endurance but uncertain about choice. This is the quiet aftermath that statistics cannot capture. It explains why the shadow of Stalinism extended far beyond his lifetime. The danger lies not in remembering terror, but in forgetting how deeply behavior can be reshaped by living under it. When fear becomes habit, power no longer needs to enforce silence. Silence sustains itself. One of the most carefully concealed consequences of Stalin's rule was how deeply it altered the relationship between the individual and responsibility. Under Stalinism, responsibility was systematically displaced upward and outward until it became abstract, distant, and unreachable. People were taught, implicitly and explicitly, that decisions were made elsewhere, by forces too large and complex to question. This belief did not emerge naturally. It was cultivated. When responsibility is removed from individuals, obedience becomes easier because moral judgment feels irrelevant. People stop asking whether an action is right or wrong and instead ask whether it is expected, permitted, or safe. Stalin's system thrived on this shift. It created an environment in which personal accountability was replaced by procedural compliance. A person could participate in harmful actions without feeling personally involved, because the action was framed as a task, an order, or a necessity imposed from above. Over time, this separation reshaped how people understood themselves. They became performers of roles rather than agents of choice. This transformation was reinforced through bureaucracy. Forms, reports, and protocols multiplied, each step distancing individuals from outcomes. A decision was no longer a moral act, it was a signature, a stamp, a checkbox. Harm became cumulative rather than personal. Each individual contribution felt too small to matter, yet together they produced immense consequences. Stalin understood that systems are most durable when no one inside them feels fully responsible for what they do. This is why blame was so often redirected toward vague enemies, saboteurs, or abstract threats. If something failed, it was not because of policy, but because of betrayal. This narrative absolved the system while punishing individuals selectively. It also discouraged reflection. Questioning outcomes risked association with disloyalty. As a result, people learned to disconnect action from conscience. This disconnection did not feel dramatic. It felt professional. It felt efficient. Over time, moral hesitation was reinterpreted as weakness. Emotional distance became a virtue. Stalin's system rewarded those who could carry out tasks without asking about consequences. This reward structure shaped entire professions. Administrators learned to value procedure over outcome. Scientists learned to avoid ethical questions. Educators learned to transmit approved narratives rather than encourage inquiry. Each field adapted differently, but the underlying logic was the same. Responsibility was dangerous. The safest position was alignment with expectation. This environment produced a paradoxical form of stability. The system appeared orderly because individuals stopped challenging it. But this order was fragile, dependent on constant avoidance. When unexpected problems arose, no one felt empowered to address them honestly. Initiative had been trained out of the population. Even when people recognized failure, they lacked the confidence and trust required to act independently. This is why reforms, when attempted, often stalled. The habits of avoidance were too deeply ingrained. People waited for permission that never came. Stalin's concealment lay in presenting this condition as normal governance. The language of necessity masked the erosion of agency. Over time, people forgot what responsibility felt like. Decisions were experienced as external events rather than choices. This psychological shift outlived policies and leaders. Even after overt repression eased, the reflex to defer remained. People continued to look upward for direction, even when direction was absent. This legacy explains why authoritarian systems can persist long after their ideological foundations collapse. They survive not through belief, but through learned helplessness. Stalin did not invent this phenomenon, but he perfected its application on a massive scale. By the time his rule ended, the system no longer needed constant enforcement. It had trained people to limit themselves. The most dangerous consequence of this training is not obedience, but passivity. A society that no longer feels responsible for its actions struggles to respond to injustice, corruption, or crisis. Problems accumulate quietly until they become unavoidable. By then, the capacity for collective action has been weakened. This is the final layer of concealment, the idea that responsibility can be safely delegated indefinitely. Stalin's rule demonstrates that when responsibility disappears, power becomes untouchable. And once power is untouchable, silence becomes permanent. One of the most deeply concealed outcomes of Stalin's rule was the systematic destruction of trust, not as an accidental consequence of terror, but as a deliberate and strategic objective. Stalin understood that a society capable of trust is a society capable of coordination, and coordination is the foundation of resistance. For this reason, distrust was cultivated carefully, patiently, and across generations. It was embedded not only in political life, but in personal relationships, professional environments, and even within families. People were encouraged to view others not as allies, but as potential risks. Loyalty was demanded publicly but never guaranteed privately. A person could behave correctly, speak cautiously, and still be destroyed without explanation. This unpredictability taught a powerful lesson: trust offered no protection. Over time, people internalized this logic. They stopped confiding in neighbors. They avoided sincerity at work. They learned that even close relationships required boundaries. This erosion of trust reshaped social life in subtle but irreversible ways. Conversations became performative. Words were chosen for safety rather than meaning. People listened not to understand, but to evaluate risk. Silence became a form of self-defense, and distance became a form of intelligence. Stalin did not need to instruct people to distrust one another explicitly. The system taught this lesson through example. Arrests often followed personal connections. Guilt spread by association. Knowing someone who fell out of favor became dangerous. As a result, people learned to reduce connections rather than deepen them. Social networks narrowed. Communities fragmented. This fragmentation protected power by preventing solidarity. A divided society cannot act collectively, even when it recognizes injustice. What made this process so effective was its plausibility. People did not feel manipulated, they felt cautious. They justified distance as common sense. Parents taught children not whom to trust, but whom to avoid. These lessons were framed as care, not fear. Over time, distrust became a cultural norm rather than a political response. Even in moments of shared hardship, cooperation was limited. People suffered together but rarely organized together. This isolation intensified vulnerability. Individuals facing repression felt alone, unable to rely on others. Stalin's system thrived on this loneliness. It ensured that resistance never reached critical mass. Even when people shared similar experiences, they lacked the trust required to recognize common cause. This condition persisted beyond the period of active terror. Habits formed under fear do not dissolve automatically. Even when the immediate threat faded, people continued to guard their words and intentions. The legacy of distrust lingered in institutions as well. Teams avoided open discussion. Organizations favored hierarchy over collaboration. Information was compartmentalized to prevent exposure. These structures appeared efficient on the surface but were deeply fragile. When crises emerged, coordination failed. People hesitated to share bad news. They delayed warnings. They avoided responsibility. The same distrust that protected power in stable times weakened the system under stress. Yet this weakness was rarely acknowledged. Official narratives celebrated unity while everyday behavior reflected fragmentation. This contradiction was never resolved. It became normal. Stalin's concealment lay in presenting distrust as vigilance and isolation as maturity. Over time, society accepted this framing. People began to see openness as naivete and trust as recklessness. This moral inversion reshaped values. Courage was redefined as endurance. Honesty was redefined as danger. Cooperation was redefined as risk. These redefinitions did not require enforcement. They spread through imitation and survival. Children observed adults navigating conversations cautiously and learned to do the same. Professionals learned to protect themselves by limiting exposure. Even friendships carried an unspoken awareness of boundaries. This pervasive caution altered emotional life. Intimacy became conditional. Empathy became selective. People learned to care quietly rather than openly. This emotional restraint reduced the likelihood of collective outrage. Suffering was experienced privately, processed individually, and rarely transformed into action. Stalin's system did not eliminate compassion, it isolated it. People felt deeply but alone. This isolation prevented solidarity from forming. What history often overlooks is that repression is not sustained only by fear of punishment, but by fear of connection. When people are unsure whom they can trust, they choose isolation over risk. Stalin's rule perfected this dynamic. It ensured that even those who opposed the system internally could not find one another reliably. This invisibility of dissent made power appear stronger than it was. In reality, opposition existed everywhere, but it was scattered, silent, and disconnected. The tragedy of this condition is its durability. Distrust, once normalized, does not vanish with policy changes. It persists in habits of interaction, in professional norms, and in emotional distance. Even after political transitions, societies shaped by this legacy struggle to rebuild trust. Cooperation feels unfamiliar. Openness feels unsafe. Collective action feels uncertain. This is why the aftermath of authoritarianism is often marked not by liberation, but by confusion. People are free in principle, but cautious in practice. Stalin did not simply rule through repression. He reshaped the social fabric in ways that outlived his regime. By the time his rule ended, distrust had become routine. And when distrust becomes routine, power no longer needs to intervene. Society regulates itself through distance. This is the most enduring and least visible consequence of Stalinism. It cannot be measured easily. It does not appear in statistics. But it shapes behavior long after the system that produced it has disappeared. Understanding this legacy is essential, because it reveals how deeply power can embed itself into everyday life without constant force. When trust is destroyed, freedom becomes abstract. And without trust, even free people remain alone. Another truth that Stalin concealed with extraordinary care was how deeply fear reshaped not only behavior, but identity itself. Over time, people did not merely adapt to repression, they redefined who they were within it. Survival required more than silence. It required self-editing. Individuals learned to fragment their personalities, separating what they thought from what they said, and what they said from what they did. This internal division became normal. People learned to present one version of themselves publicly and reserve another for private reflection, if that reflection was allowed at all. Eventually, even private thought became cautious. Self-censorship moved inward. This transformation did not happen through a single decree or campaign. It unfolded gradually, reinforced by experience. Every arrest taught a lesson. Every disappearance confirmed uncertainty. Every public denunciation demonstrated the cost of deviation. Over time, people learned not to fully inhabit their own thoughts. Doubt felt safer than conviction. Ambiguity felt safer than clarity. Stalin's system did not require enthusiasm, it required compliance at the level of identity. When people stop trusting their own judgment, authority no longer needs to persuade them. They begin to doubt themselves preemptively. This internal erosion of confidence had profound consequences. Individuals became hesitant not only to speak, but to decide. Everyday choices were filtered through imagined scrutiny. What might this look like? How could this be interpreted? Is this necessary? This constant calculation drained emotional energy. People became cautious, restrained, and inward-focused. Creativity suffered. Spontaneity disappeared. Even joy felt risky if it drew attention. Stalin understood that a population preoccupied with self-regulation is easier to govern. Energy spent on self-monitoring is energy not spent on resistance. Over time, this condition reshaped culture. Art became symbolic and indirect. Literature spoke in metaphors. Music avoided dissonance. Public expression flattened into repetition. What appeared as unity was often exhaustion. The same process affected moral life. People learned to justify actions they would once have questioned. Participation in harmful systems was reframed as inevitability. There was no choice, became a common explanation. Over time, this explanation hardened into belief. People stopped asking whether choices existed. They assumed they did not. This assumption protected the system. A population convinced of powerlessness does not challenge authority. It adapts to it. Stalin's concealment lay in presenting this adaptation as realism. Those who questioned were labeled naive or dangerous. Those who complied were labeled mature and responsible. This moral inversion reshaped social values. Integrity became suspicious. Consistency became risky. Flexibility became virtue. People learned to adjust narratives quickly, to align with shifting expectations. This adaptability was praised, but it came at a cost. It eroded continuity of self. Individuals learned to survive by becoming less defined. Opinions softened. Beliefs blurred. Commitments became conditional. This loss of definition made collective identity fragile. Without shared convictions, solidarity weakened. People coexisted but did not cohere. Stalin's system exploited this fragmentation. It ensured that even when people sensed injustice, they lacked the internal certainty required to confront it. Fear did not only silence voices, it confused conscience. This confusion persisted even when repression eased. Habits formed under pressure do not vanish automatically. People continued to second-guess themselves long after the immediate threat passed. This lingering uncertainty shaped post-Stalin society profoundly. Even reforms were met with hesitation. People waited for clarity that never fully arrived. They tested boundaries cautiously, unsure whether change was genuine or temporary. This caution slowed transformation and preserved old patterns. Stalin's legacy, therefore, was not only political or institutional. It was psychological. He left behind a society trained to mistrust its own impulses. This training affected generations. Children raised by cautious adults inherited caution. Emotional restraint was passed down as wisdom. Ambition was moderated by fear of exposure. Over time, these traits became cultural norms. They were no longer recognized as responses to repression. They felt natural. This normalization is one of the most dangerous outcomes of authoritarianism. When adaptation becomes identity, repression no longer feels imposed. It feels chosen. Stalin's system succeeded not because it eliminated individuality, but because it reshaped it. People remained distinct, but constrained. They learned to exist within narrow margins, adjusting constantly to invisible limits. This constant adjustment created a quiet fatigue that permeated everyday life. People endured, but rarely flourished. The tragedy of this condition lies in its invisibility. It does not announce itself as oppression. It appears as caution, pragmatism, and maturity. Yet it limits possibility just as effectively as open violence. Understanding this transformation is essential, because it reveals how power can extend beyond laws and institutions into the deepest layers of human experience. When fear reshapes identity, liberation requires more than policy change. It requires rebuilding trust in one's own judgment. Stalin's rule demonstrates how difficult that rebuilding can be once self-doubt becomes habitual. And that is why the end of terror does not automatically restore freedom. Freedom must be relearned. And relearning it takes longer than repression itself. The final truth about Stalin is not contained in a single document, archive, or statistic, but in what happened when his voice finally fell silent. In March 1953, when Stalin died, there was no immediate clarity, no instant relief, and no sudden return of certainty. What followed was hesitation. People waited to see what would happen next, unsure whether silence itself might still be dangerous. This reaction revealed more than decades of propaganda ever could. It showed how deeply the system had reshaped behavior. Even death did not immediately end fear. Only years later, in 1956, when parts of the truth were cautiously acknowledged in a closed political address, did the scale of concealment begin to surface publicly. Yet even then, the revelation was partial, controlled, and limited. It was enough to confirm suffering, but not enough to explain how it had become possible. What remained largely unspoken was the mechanism. Stalin's rule was not sustained by terror alone, nor by ideology alone, nor by personality alone. It was sustained by the quiet transformation of everyday life. By the time the system loosened, generations had learned to live within its constraints. They had learned how to survive uncertainty, how to avoid clarity, how to adapt rather than confront. This is why the aftermath felt confusing rather than liberating. Freedom, when it arrived, felt abstract. People had learned endurance, not choice. The historical facts matter because they anchor this story in reality, but they do not explain its endurance. The real legacy lies in behavior. Stalin's greatest concealment was not a crime hidden in an archive, but a lesson taught silently, that power does not need to be constant to be effective, that fear does not need to be visible to be real, and that silence can become normal. When later generations looked back, they often asked how such a system could exist for so long. The uncomfortable answer is that it did not exist only above people. It existed within them. It reshaped habits, relationships, language, and memory. It taught people to read between lines, to wait rather than act, to doubt themselves before questioning authority. This internalization is what allowed the system to survive crises, war, and even the death of its creator. Historical facts mark the beginning and the end, but the space between them was filled with adaptation. That adaptation explains why the past does not stay neatly contained in history books. It echoes in institutions, in cultural caution, in inherited restraint. Even when the system was officially condemned, many of its behavioral patterns remained. People remembered what it felt like to be careful. They remembered that safety often came from invisibility. These memories did not vanish with speeches or reforms. They faded slowly, unevenly, and sometimes not at all. This is why understanding Stalin's era requires more than moral judgment. It requires attention to process. It requires recognizing how easily extraordinary conditions can become ordinary, and how ordinary behavior can sustain extraordinary harm. The story does not end with condemnation or closure. It ends with a question that remains relevant beyond one country or one century. How much of what people accept as normal is shaped by fear they no longer recognize? Stalin's rule demonstrates that power can endure not by convincing people to believe, but by teaching them to adapt. And adaptation, once learned, does not disappear on command. The final lesson is not about one man, but about human behavior under pressure. When silence becomes habit, truth becomes fragile. When fear becomes routine, freedom becomes unfamiliar. Remembering this is not about reopening wounds. It is about understanding how they formed. Because only by understanding how silence was learned can it ever be unlearned. And that, ultimately, is where this story closes, not with certainty, but with awareness.